I can sit in the studio and just make whatever. But as soon as people start asking questions, then you're having to think about them more.
What is up, Shaping Nation? This is Nick Torres here. And these next 3 episodes are going to be part of a 3-part series that I did with an interview with Tim C. The reason why I'm doing it as a 3-part series is because Tim provided so much value in this episode that I just couldn't leave anything out. So with that in mind, part 1 of this 3-part series is all about how Tim used teaching to help him grow his own pottery and to help other potters as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this part, and I'll see you guys in it. Tim, welcome to Shaping Your Pottery, and share with me, what is something potters should be doing to have success in pottery?
I think the most important thing when I see career potters and, people coming up, and what I look for myself is that I'm having fun. If I'm not enjoying it, then I'm not going to spend time in the studio. And if you're not enjoying the time in the studio, then you're trying to get out of it as much as you can. And I think success, and I think in any career, is about wanting to be doing the thing that you're doing so that you do it well and you do it as much as you can. Because without doing that, then you're behind. You're always like, well, I got to do this. And like when I was making work that wasn't as exciting to make, it was a slog to be in the studio. Like, oh, now I got to go to the studio and I got to do this. And then I have to do these other things to the pots that I don't care about or I don't want to do. And the work suffered and the excitement suffers. And then you try to sell something that you're not excited about. And then that suffers. And then just cascades down to doing crappy work over and over and over in a way you didn't want to do it, not having fun.
Definitely.
Right?
Definitely agree. 100%.
Fun, right?
Shaping Nation, the most important thing, just have fun. Make what you want to make. I love that. Yeah. So tell me the story how you got started in ceramics.
The short, long version, because there's lots of different versions of this depending on the time frame that we have. I was a speed skater. I was internationally competitive. I was good, and I hurt my knees. And after I hurt one of my knees, I took some not time off, but less stressful stuff, and I ended up going to college. And then I hurt my other knee. I was able to put all my time into college. And instead of spending like 60 hours on skates or a bike, I had that time to put into something. I was in a ceramic sculpture class at a community college, and I sat at an 8-foot table, normal plywood table, about 8 feet away from a pottery wheel. And man, that looked fun. Like there were people throwing pots on the wheel. I was like, when do we get to do that? And the professor said, you don't, we're in a sculpture class. And at the time I was also sitting next to, who is now my wife, wasn't planned at the time, but at that moment I sat next to my future career and my wife, all in that one little moment at a 19-year-old, pottery class. And the wheel, weren't allowed to use it. As soon as he left the room, he was gone for the day, end of the class. I got on the wheel, and people around, were like, hey, you're totally doing that wrong. I don't care. That was it. I was hooked. And I spent 4 years there until, it's a 2-year school. It's a community college. They're like, you got to go someplace else. And I applied to all sorts of schools and didn't get into any. And SU said they'd take my money at Syracuse University. And so I went to Syracuse University, got my bachelor's, and then applied everywhere for my graduate work. And again, didn't get into anywhere. And at the time I was teaching at a place called Clayscapes, the YMCA and Clayscapes Pottery. And I was doing shows. Like I had my first summer out of school, I had 19 shows lined up. So I was doing it as a career as soon as I got out of college, and the graduate school stuff just didn't seem to fit anymore. And that's kind of what it's been since. I taught for 15 years at Clayscapes. I say I retired a couple years ago so that I could spend more time doing workshops, which is where I think most of my educational stuff ends up going, is towards workshops and the online stuff that I do. And then the other half is making pots and selling pots. So that's where it started, and that's kind of where it is now.
So how did teaching impact your career as a potter?
So it gave me a base of income to start. So, early 2000s, the craft market wasn't super great. It had just kind of come off the 90s, which I guess was awesome. And all the old potter people were like, oh man, the 90s were great until every time I went into her. And then the 2000s, like, oh, this sucks. And it's like, that's when I got into it. And it's like, well, so it was a lot of going to shows, making enough to like get home and buy more clay, but it wasn't like I was making a living. Teaching at Clayscapes and the other places were weekly income. And that's kind of how it started was, it's a safe, reliable source of income. But it also trained me a lot on what I knew or how I knew it, because I had to explain to these people that are now taking a class and paying for it why their pieces were blowing up or why they were cracking. And at Clayscapes, we had 120 students a week through the studio. They weren't all mine, but, I saw a lot of them. So anytime there was an issue, it was a really big pool to learn stuff. If we wanted to deal with an issue of cracking or something, I could go through and be like, okay, well, what did these people do that didn't cause a crack? Or what did these people do that did cause a crack? And I had to unlearn a lot of the stuff that I learned in college because, it's what the professor says is right rather than let's test it. So teaching gave me the perspective of test everything. Let's not just go with what I learned. Let's go with what we can prove or what we can see or what, actually happens in the studio. And I don't think I would have gotten to that point without having to explain and teach it to people that had no idea what was going on. So besides just having an income, it was also a great way for me to learn, one, about just the technical stuff of what's happening with the clay, but also, when you're in a studio with a lot of people, you have to justify everything that you're doing because you're going to get asked. So if I'm sitting in the studio and I'm making a thing, which is what happened with the whole robot stuff that I do, I was just painting typewriter parts, and somebody goes, "Why are you painting typewriter parts?" And I'm like, "Why are you in the studio? Get out! This is my room." And eventually, they come in again. I'm like, "Well, why are you painting a robot?" And it gets to a point where you're having to make these, on-the-fly justifications for the things that you're doing, and make it make enough sense that they will leave you alone for the next 15 minutes, rather than just keep asking questions. And it was those kind of interactions that grew things that I don't think ever would have happened without that studio interaction with people people together, conversing and asking questions. I don't know. Do you know Periscope? Does that ring a bell?
No. So
Periscope was a live streaming app that was a spinoff of Twitter. And prior to that, there was it was before Ring. There were like security cams, right? Mm-hmm. That you could put up and you could subscribe to, or you could subscribe to them and you could always watch your door. I bought one and I said, hey, for people I was unloading a wood kiln. I said, if you want to watch the wood kiln unloading or whatever, you can subscribe to this. I'll give you or you don't have to subscribe. I'll give you the number. You can log in and watch in real time an unloading. And because I could see what was happening, because I could watch it too, I could hear what they were asking and stuff because you can talk through it. So it was like a pre-Periscope. And so why is that important? Because when Periscope happened, it streamlined it all. It made it really easy and allowed people to come into my studio that weren't there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It was like the modern version of YouTube before it was out.
No, it was after YouTube because it was live. So I'm painting a robot and people are watching me paint the robot and then asking questions in real time. You don't hear it, can you? Can you hear it?
No, you can just keep talking. It really doesn't matter.
So people were watching in real time as I'm painting a robot and asking questions. And I could right then go well, why does he have a hat on his head? And it's like, oh, well, and then I'd paint why he had a hat on his head. And it would just kind of continue like that. So when I, was missing studio collaboration with other people, I could go online and post everything. And Periscope ended up creating its own little community of potters that would, be live streaming and having other potters right there with them, even though I've made a lot of friends just around the country and around the world because we were all in each other's studio together, just really far apart. Yeah. So that reiterated. It nailed down how important that kind of stuff happens. And now, with Facebook, you can do Facebook Lives, and Instagram, you can do Instagram Lives, and it's the same kind of thing that I still find important. I don't do it as much during this part of the time of the year, but in the winter, I do a lot more of it because I'm lonely. It's cold and sad in New York.
I love that. Shaping Nation, if you can get around other potters, then you're going to be able to take your pottery a lot further. I love that. And if you can explain it, then you go even further as well. I love that so much.
Yeah, just doing it, you don't have there's no accountability. I can sit in the studio and just make whatever. But as soon as people start asking questions, then you're having to think about them more. Not that you can't do it yourself, but I know for myself, and I've seen it in other people, that if you don't have that, I don't know if accountability is the right word, but let's just say accountability, that you sometimes get away with stuff or you let stuff slide that you might not if you're having to make those justifications to somebody else. I think, like when I mentor people, it's, I'm asking those questions that I know I would want asked of me in the studio, because those points of thinking help push things past what are easy or simple. I think a lot of times our default is to okay, let's just make this simpler, not harder. And typically, if I'm being really critical of my work, I'm always making something harder. But, critical Tim isn't always in the studio. A lot of times it's, I want to make stuff, Tim. And he's just doing whatever the hell he wants. But when there's somebody else, you don't get the choice. They always have the option or possibility of being critical, which isn't a bad thing. I always find it to be good.
So you mentioned you would ask them, the people that you're mentoring, some questions. What are some of the questions you would ask them?
Oh, it depends on how far the relationship is. Like a new mentor-mentee relationship, it usually starts with naming the parts of a piece, because if you can't name it, then you can't make a decision on it. And I've done these exercises a lot now with a lot of different people. And I'd say the beginning of the conversation is typically 5-10 pieces at most. They get to 10 pieces and they go, oh, that's all the parts there are of a mug or whatever. And then later on, it should be maybe 10, 20. And somebody that's done a lot of it and practiced this and really thought about their pots a lot might be able to get to 30, 40 parts of a pot. And parts are kind of hard to explain, but we got to run out of Wadsworth mug. If I said, and then you start thinking maybe more, maybe there's the inner part of the lip or the outer part, or if there's a segmentation, all those things can be parts. And then once you can name a part, you can change that part. So if I'm looking at the upper part of a foot, which is something I hadn't thought of until a couple weeks ago. So the upper part of a foot, you can go through all the principles and elements of art, which if you can't name it, then you don't get a chance to do that. So the more parts you name, the more decisions you get to make. The more decisions you get to make, the further you go away from the simple solutions, which is where, the next part of the mentor-mentee conversation is, what makes something yours? And if we stick with the things that are simple, it becomes more reproducible on accident. So if I gave somebody a chunk of clay and said, make a mug, I can picture, what somebody's going to do. It's going to be a cylindrical kind of thing. It might be a this, might be a little that. It's going to have a handle. But how do you make that more yours is getting further and further away from what most people would end up doing. And it kind of starts with the naming the pieces and then making decisions, conscious decisions about those parts. And if, as an exercise, I usually say, draw a mug, just a straight side mug. And then, draw 10 handles. And then take one of those handles that you thought was different than the rest of the handles, and draw 10 versions of that handle. And then pick one of those and draw 10 versions of that handle. And get as far as you can, where you can't make any more versions of that handle at the current technological part of your brains. You'll go back to that. You might go back and be able to draw 10 different ones in a month or a year later. But at the time, you've stretched the capacity of what you can think of at the time. And then you make one or two of them. And because making is going to establish other, trains of thought until now you're getting, maybe 10, 15 steps away from that simple solution. And that's where things start to become more recognizable as somebody's, body of work. The original or whatever, I'd like to say original, but, we're working typically from a bank of things that we've collected in our brains. And it's a matter of putting them together differently to make something else come out. There aren't many options or opportunities to come up with something that, is completely new. But I don't say it's impossible, because then what the hell are we doing? Right? If everything's been done under the sun, I should just be pushing buttons somewhere and be making more money or, getting to do tiny boat stuff more often. But instead, we're trying to do things, at least I am, or I'm teaching the people that I'm participating with, that there are things that are still not done. And the only way we're going to find them is by doing things that aren't done. If we keep doing the same things, we're never going to make anything different.
I love that. I love that so much. Shapy Nation, start out with something very, very simple. But then once you have that simple thing mastered, start making some little tiny adjustments until you have found something that is truly yours. I like that a lot.
And there's, even that one process, so we talked about, naming the parts and doing little changes. There's the drawing process of it. You can do the simple drawings, but also you can make parts. So I've done oil cans for probably 15 years now. And each time I do them, I try to come up with other ways of producing different oil cans. And I think my most effective way is to sit and not think about the finished oil can at all. There are times where I will draw exactly what I want to build, and other times where I'll just make parts. I'll sit at the wheel and I'll make one part, and I'll say, we got some in process. So I'll make a bunch of these parts, and each one I do, I'll make a different part, and not because of what's drawn, a drawing or anything, but it's because of what's happening at the wheel, or the tools that I have in front of me. I might introduce a lot of tools. I'll have them all laid out, or I'll have one tool, so that I'm limited, or I guess unlimited. And I think those variations in that allow different thought process to happen. So in something like this, I've got maybe 2 tools on the table. And it's what can I do with those 2 tools? And I start with one thing. And if I was to take a picture of all the little parts that I made, you could actually see here's outside threads, or here's threads at the bottom. And then I was why don't I have threads at the top? It's why don't I have threads on the inside? And all those variations happen because I'm physically doing those things and having them in front of me and seeing them. And then when I get to the done, maybe 10 or 15 of those, where I started and where I ended, 2 totally different things I wouldn't have done. And then you multiply that by every single part on a piece, and now you got a huge variety of things that I may not have come up with if I was doing drawings or just thinking about it. But the physicality of having them in front of me, builds on. And then, when you're doing something complex, now you've got where you're putting them, and just where it sits on the piece, where the other parts attach, all those things start to add up to where, if you're critical and you're looking at how you're doing those kind of things, or on the other side, just letting it happen and then thinking about it later, you get to come up with all sorts of different processes. And I guess I hate those words that are relationships and they're having a conversation. It just right up my spine. But it's kind of what's happening. That there's a relationship between the parts, and you only really get to have that when they're 3-dimensional and you're spinning them around and you're looking at how things are lining up. So that's that way. Oh, there's one more, and then there's doing all the stuff that you're not supposed to do. So the opposite. I don't know if you've watched Seinfeld, but there's the George does everything the opposite and everything works out, or was it Jerry? I don't know. Somebody does. And so if I know I want a grungy looking teapot kind of thing, that if I do everything the opposite of grungy kind of teapot stuff, I'm pushing my thought process and my pots in a way that is opposite that to gain perspective. So if I can get that perspective of having the opposite of what I had done, it informs what it is. So if somebody came, Tim, I want to make really complex pots. First thing I would have them do is make a complex pot, go through all that stuff, and then make the simplest pot they can. What is the simplest pot that you can make? That is a great exercise. It's the complex, but making something as simple as possible becomes a real stretch because we're so used to overindulging and putting as much stuff on it as we can. But when you think about making something as simple as possible, then it becomes this whole other part of our brain has to go through these exercises that it's not used to, but it influences the more complex stuff in different ways that I find brain-wise very entertaining. Those kind of processes, when I go into the studio and I'm trying to do opposites of things, usually are more exciting than the things I was trying to make. If I wanted a really grungy pot and I make a really not grungy pot, those are always so much more exciting to me because there's stuff that I'm not. Or it's almost like watching a TV show that you know the ending of. I know where I'm going with the grungy stuff. The non-grungy thing, are like a new TV show. I've never seen it before. It's not like the 7th time I've seen this Seinfeld episode. It's like The Walking Dead. It's all new. Like, I don't know what's going to happen to Rick Grimes. Like, oh, something really horrible could, but I don't know. So it's exciting to be a part of. And I think that's the last major way that I forgot what we're talking about. That's the last major way that I go through, like, kind of coming up with newer ideas or different ideas.
I love that idea of doing the opposite to spark new ideas. Because that gives you so much more perspective. That is such great advice right there.
It's not a normal process, right? Like, how often are you like, oh, I want to make a, whatever, and then somebody says to do the opposite. It's not a normal line of reasoning, but it's super. It works really well for me. Tell me if it works. Find out if it works well for you.
I agree 100% with that, doing opposite, because when I was creating my characters that I'm making, I didn't know if I wanted like swords or like knives for them, and I would just play around with different things, and I eventually found one I did, but that didn't happen by simply doing the same thing over and over again. It happened by doing the opposite things. I love that. Did you give him
spoons?
And what?
Did you give him spoons?
That would have been a cool idea. I do have an idea too. I do have make a character where it's holding like a wooden spoon
and a pillow.
that would be a good idea. Maybe sometime in the future I could try that. I love that.